The first chap, Anthony Peake, he was on my show a while ago. Very interesting bloke. And the reason I've put these two questions together is that I know a lot of people, when I say I have a lot of guests talking about consciousness, they say, Mandy, what is consciousness? And I asked him, actually, this question, and he gives a really clear and very interesting answer. And then I went on to ask him, do you believe in God? And normally you would just get a yes or a no, or if you were in a pub late at night, you might get a slightly different answer. But anyway, he answers that too, and that's a very interesting answer. So I put those two together, and this man was called Anthony Peake. Bearing in mind that half my audience, know a little bit about this stuff, and half really don't, maybe we can start from a place of not knowing and just explain.
Okay.
When somebody says consciousness, how would you define that, Tony?
I define consciousness as that something that is self-aware. In other words, you can have a brain, and you can have a brain that functions, but to become conscious, you have to be aware of the fact that you're conscious. And it's probably one of the most fascinating areas of scientific and philosophical endeavour as to what it is that makes us conscious beings that have a memory, beings that react to reality in a particular way. So consciousness is probably the most mysterious thing in the universe. What is it that my brain is made up of inanimate objects, it's made of molecules, it's made up of lots of chemicals, but something magic happens in the brain that suddenly changes it into something that's fully aware. And
yes.
That in itself is just strange. In fact, there's a whole area now developing in America called consciousness studies, and they're actually analysing now what it is to be conscious. And indeed, how far down does consciousness go? Are animals conscious? Does it go down even further? Is there a collective consciousness that we're all part of?
Do you think there is?
I do, yeah. Funnily enough, there's an associate of mine called Karl Marx, who's come up with a concept that's allied to my book called collapsing the consciousness wave. And that's the idea that there is a wave of consciousness out there, and an aware human being or a sentient being collapses that consciousness wave, and it becomes a particle of consciousness. So that would explain things like precognition. It could explain things like astral traveling, things like distance viewing. A lot of these areas could be explained scientifically by applying particle physics and particle physics terminology to consciousness itself.
Yeah. I speak to a lot of people, particularly people who are interested in maybe psychic mediums or people who are dealing with angels, who deal with all this stuff, if you like, and they're not so much aware of why it happens. They're just aware of wanting to get in deeper touch with it. But you're coming from a different angle, really, are you?
I am.
You want to know why.
I want to know why.
Yeah.
I lecture regularly across the country, and in fact I'm over to the States in August to do some lectures over there as well. And the people that come to my lectures can be anything from hardline scientists to psychologists, and I get a lot of mediums and a lot of experiences. Now, clearly, whatever has been experienced by these people is very, very real. It's very real to them. The question is, how do we explain what is happening to them in a way that makes science sit up and say, there's something different about this? Because as you and I know, most scientists will dismiss these things out of hand, and that's wrong. What we have to do is to realize that something very real and very genuine is happening, and how can we fit that into our understanding of the nature of reality? Now, if you start looking into the latest research in particle physics and everything else, there is an awful lot within particle physics that supports the whole idea of mediumship and such like. For instance, you're probably aware that it has been long known that particles communicate instantaneously, subatomic particles, as if they are telepathic. Now, this is a really interesting thing that a few weeks ago I met up with one of Britain's top particle physicists, Professor Jeff Forshaw, and Jeff and I are both doing a talk down at the National Theatre in London on the 24th of July. And Jeff and I were discussing over coffee, and Jeff turned round to me, and quite frankly, he turned round and he said, do you know that every electron in the universe knows the position of every other electron? And from a top particle physicist such as that, and that's, that was a truism. He wasn't saying that we believe, we think. It's, we know that they do. So there you have telepathy at the most smallest level of particles. So clearly there is something about reality that we haven't quite twigged yet. And I think that by bringing together the experiences of mediums and individuals like that, together with scientists, we might put it all together and suddenly it will spot a much, much bigger picture. And that's my philosophy, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, the bigger picture, whatever, God, whatever word people want to give it, the greater intelligence or whatever, where is your angle? Where do you come at it from that? Do you believe in a single creator? Do you believe in an intelligence that's...
A fascinating question. My religious beliefs are, very much from the agnostic stroke atheist viewpoint. However, that doesn't necessarily preclude the idea that there is not something behind the universe, is the word that's motivating it and moving it along. Because, as I was saying before, the whole concept of consciousness, what is it to be conscious? And, the big question, why is there anything rather than nothing? And indeed, why is it that we are consciously aware? The world could work just as well with human beings not being aware at all of anything. And as soon as you start to develop self-awareness, you start to realize about people worry about their mortality, and they look for reasons in things. Now, there is something called the anthropic cosmological principle. And this is a big issue in science at the moment. In fact, a recent book was written on it called The Goldilocks Enigma. And what this says is that if you look at the science of the Big Bang from the first few seconds of the Big Bang, everything in the universe was hardwired for the evolution of conscious life. Everything. It was as if there was a blueprint and a plan. And that plan has been fulfilled and is continuing to be fulfilled now. Because if there is only one universe, the universe at the very first chance got everything right.
Yeah, that's
in order
amazing.
for you and I to be here now having this discussion. Now, there is an argument to say that, well, whatever set of circumstances came about, whatever a conscious being would be looking back would say that there's a whole series of coincidences here. I mean, for instance, the argument that somebody who wins the lottery will say, my God, I'm incredibly lucky, I've just won the lottery. Somebody will win it. But this is quite different. It is that even the tiniest imbalance in the first few seconds of the Big Bang would have mean life as we know it, or life of any description would not have evolved. Now, there's a counter-argument to that to say, well, there could be trillions of universes, and we just happen to live in the universe that is right for human beings to evolve.
Yeah.
But that, again, adds millions of questions, because that then asks the question, well, if there's millions of universes, there's millions of us having this conversation as well.
Millions, yeah. Okay, keep going. I'm listening.
Okay. So that's the alternative. That's something called the many worlds interpretation of particle physics. So particle physics has got two areas. Either there is some form of vague design going on, and if there's design, there's the implication of the designer, and who that designer could possibly be could be the concept of God, for want of a better term.
Yeah. With a plan.
With a plan, yeah. Or it could be that it's just blind chance, but blind chance is stretching it, I think, a little bit. Of course, one then has to say, well, yes, there might be an intelligence behind it all, but whether that intelligence is immanent in our lives is theology, and it's an area I never really go into because I try to deal with the science rather than the theology. But for my own personal beliefs, the more I've read about these things, the more open to these ideas I've become.